this could be controversial, these guys, right? Because we're talking about the timber industry, and there's been so much noise about forests, old growth forests, but this is renewable forests, right? These are all certified forests.
Yeah, these guys live and breathe it, and also compete in the same markets to a degree, but been kind enough to give us their time.
In the same room?
In the same room.
What genius did that? Huh?
Yeah, I mean, John and Aaron on that one.
This could turn into like World War III over there.
I think they're going to show up.
Are they mates?
I'm not sure.
So we've got Shane Vicary, CEO of AKD. What's AKD?
AKD is a timber mill in southwest
Australia's largest sawmiller. Okay, 20 years experience, sawmilling, 100% plantation forests. That's awesome. 65 years old, these plantations are. That's amazing. And they absorb more than 5 million tonnes of carbon from the atmosphere every year. Okay, now I want to meet this bloke. What about Craig Stratford? Have you met him before?
Well, yes, I met Craig. He's also a customer of ours out at Holt, Harvey, regional Victoria, northeast of Victoria.
Cool.
Claimed to have a carbon negative timber manufacturing process that we need to delve into.
Wow. Mate, I'm looking forward to this. This is the podcast. Hey, you guys come from some pretty amazing backgrounds, and there's been so much innovation in the wood industry over the years. And I guess I'm going to kick it off by just sort of saying necessity is the mother of all invention, isn't it, really? And, when we talk about, using timber in the construction industry, we're now just getting so much smarter about how much of that timber is used and not wasted, how it's put together to create maximum tensile strength and compactive strength. And you guys are at the forefront of it, so I just can't wait to pick your brains. Where have you seen the biggest change, Craig, like in your years in the industry?
Yeah, so definitely technology is playing a role in the processing.
Yeah.
And processing, right from the forest growing through to the end product and the use of those end products in their applications. So technology has played a role. I think the passion for the product's grown too. I think what you see Australian people looking at the products that we produce and say it's a good feeling to be connected back to the environment. That's definitely growing in Australia, which is fantastic.
Well, we're all intrinsically connected to nature, right? We all forget this, but I feel, I don't know about you blokes, but I feel way better now that I've got, a golden cane sitting in the background there and a happy plant, right? It does make the room feel better. Like we are intrinsically green. Children study better when they're connected to nature. There's something about working in a green industry that makes you get out of bed with a bit more zip in your step, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
So what were we doing wrong and what are we doing now that you think's created a catalyst for change?
So I wouldn't say we were doing it wrong. I think we were doing in Australia what we understood to be the process.
Yeah.
And I think what you see now is a better focus right through the process on making sure we're extracting value. And that's something that Australian manufacturing's needed to do, to stay competitive. But also to ensure that we could stand up and say, we care about the environment. We are a industry that's connected, right through the whole process. So I think a better focus, definitely. And I don't think we can judge what's come before us because, our industry particularly has been built on what we've done. The people that have been invested, the people that have planted trees, the people that have bought the trucks, the machinery, gone and had education in this space on how to, be in manufacturing and the right processes and taken time overseas. So there's a wealth of knowledge that's been built, and I think in each stage what's happening is the industry is evolving and we're getting smarter about it. Rather than what we were doing in the past wasn't relevant, I think that's helped us get to where we are today.
So you get into an elevator with somebody and you got to go from 0 to 5 and you got just that amount of space to tell them what it is you do. What is your elevator pitch?
Yeah, so the product that I'm now specifically in is plywood, and we're straight on the front foot we're a carbon negative product.
Wow.
You know, and that connects to people, you know, and we get to be carbon negative because, you know, our processing facility is 5 kilometres away from where the trees are growing in a beautiful environment in northeast Victoria. So you do, you know, it's not just what we do that allows us to say that, it's the partners we work with too. But it's you can see that grabs people's attention. Totally. And they want to know a bit more about plywood, and you know, I know Shane's in similar spaces in the products that they produce as well.
Yeah. So there's stats floating around like we're losing 38 football fields of natural forest every minute of every day somewhere in the world. And that's virgin forest. What you guys are doing, just for everyone's sake here listening, is very different.
Yes.
Because we're talking about renewable.
Yep. We definitely
well, sorry. We're talking about a renewable resource. Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, timber products are the ultimate renewable. I mean, it's, you know, it's...
Why do you say that?
Oh, and look, I mean, I sat here biting my tongue as you asked Craig questions, you know, waiting for my chance. I mean, there's something beautiful about timber.
That's
right?
the Kiwi in him. He's fighting. He's coming out from the corner.
Yeah,
He's coming out with a few punches here, Craig.
Absolutely. Look, I mean... Yeah, you asked for the elevator pitch. Maybe I'll go for the 30-story version versus the 5-story.
Okay, yeah, give it to us.
Well, I literally left high school, went and worked at the meatworks. So you know, I had a different sort of start to my career, and then I ended up at university. Did everything, you know, the commerce
in
degree. In Otago,
yep.
Absolutely.
Good wine from there.
Yeah, I probably wasn't interested in wine at that age, Jamie. It was a different. It was more of a Spates focus at the time. But where I was going with that is that I ended up in the forest industry by accident. I got a job driving a forklift at an MDF plant, and then I got an opportunity to become procurement manager dealing with sawmills. And so we're talking in the 90s. And there's a sort of a saying in our industry about getting sawdust in your veins. And then once you've got sawdust in your veins, it's pretty hard to leave the industry.
Yep.
And it's there's something really, really powerful and evocative about it. And it's because you know that you're doing something that's really good. So back in the 90s, you know, before we were talking about sustainability the way we talk about it today, you know, there's a really constructive, positive, you know, purpose to what you're doing. You're creating this product and products that we've been creating for hundreds of years. And what's really sexy about it is that it's a future product as well. So it's not just that we're talking about something that's historic, but if you go to Europe and you look at some of the oldest houses built in Europe and still standing, you know, they've been built with timber products. Hundreds of years ago.
Yeah,
I think, Shane, with your sawdust in your veins, which is 100% true, it's part of the reason we respect so much about where this industry's evolved from, because we're often working alongside the people that are still working in this industry.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, so when we think about 20 years ago, you don't have to go too far to find the person that was in the business 20 years ago.
That's
They're actually still working 2 doors down, or they're still operating this machine, or, you know, and it's fun because you hear the stories. You get to, you know, relive some of those times that people have had as the world's changed around the timber industry too.
Some of the things that I'm really keen to get both of your insights on is that over 20 plus years in this sector, one thing that I was quite surprised about when I first visited both of your facilities was actually the amount of technology and the complexity that's involved, you know, in terms of, you know, dealing with the timber waste as it comes from, you know, being deforested through your facility. Just the approach from a technology perspective, I can imagine 20 years ago looked very different. You know, you're optimizing yield now, you know, in your timber recovery down to, and you'll tell me the percentages here, but there's very little wastage in your process. And I can imagine 20 years ago that technology wasn't available. How have you managed to keep up as an industry to that change, and how different does it look to when you first started on a forklift and first got involved in this sector?
I think so. New Zealand and Australia, it's a bit like, how do I say this really politely, but there's parts of our two nations, let's think of it as Anzacs rather than enemies, our two nations where we punch above our weight class.
Yep.
Yeah, we've got world-class athletes and world-class teams competing against nations that have far bigger resources and far bigger population bases. And if you actually look at our timber industry, it's exactly the same. You know, and our forefathers have thought intergenerationally, like the plantation assets that we have. You know, and so we use the word forestry and plantation the same. So so my mind doesn't automatically go to negativity around forestry, because I look at plantations and forestry being both really positive uses of the land. And you know, our forefathers, if you like, planted the trees and invested in the sawmills the way that they did and the locations that they did. You know, we're talking like upwards of 150 years ago, on the basis of enabling that we would have construction materials that would would enable nation building. Before populate or perish was a concept in the 50s. If you sort of march that forward to, you know, the technology, where I'm going with this, Kiwis and Aussies love to travel, right? So we love looking overseas, and so we have the benefit of going, we like that in the USA, we'll grab that bit of machinery. We like that in Europe, we'll grab that bit of machinery. Yeah. So so if you go to any of the facilities, typically you're looking at something that is a bit of a haberdashery of multiple nations, but it's at the forefront of technology. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's jump into product, because, you know, there's, as George was saying, that there is so much technology behind the engineering side of your businesses, and we've heard all the big song and dance recently about CLT, cross-laminated timber. You guys have been involved in LVL, yeah? What's the difference, just for everyone else's sake?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is the end use application.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we have is we start with a tree, you know, that we see process into logs, and there's many applications from that fibre.
Yep.
So if you think about those two products specifically, I think it's better to think about the range of products you can see that people are generating, because they're thinking differently about uses for that fibre.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's solid timber that's been seen as something that's, you know, processed from a tree that's a valuable product to generate, whether you see that using directly in applications, or you see that same solid bit of timber applied in an application with other wood fibres, you know, whether it's a panel, and now they're creating, you know, a cassette, and that cassette's going into the use of building. You know, it's thinking differently about that fibre. So I think for the question, Jamie, what we've got to think about is the innovation that's going on for uses in that fibre to create value, you know, that an end user can see the value in and is prepared to use in an application is exciting.
Yeah.
CLT's, you know, has been formed from that thinking and done overseas. You know, like Shana said, you know, some idea generations occurred, and then we've got really great architects, designers in Australia that are grabbing hold of wood products and coming up with new designs and ways to apply those products into building and construction that allows CLT to be formed, you know, in Australia. You know, is it a big part of the market yet? No. But these many, you know, streams that are opening up are creating opportunities for businesses like ours and others, you know, to seek out how we produce a product that could be applied in that fashion. Yeah. So there's a whole parcel of products, you know, that really come from that sustainable plantation forestry that we do have here in Australia. Yeah. Which is fantastic.
And so I guess for everyone else's sakes, CLT is cross-laminated timber where the fibres are running across each other,
yes,
to provide a better integrity and strength and tensile strength in the product, right?
Yes.
LVL is where all the fibres are running in one direction and laid over the top of each other.
Yep.
And the cuts are laid like brickwork.
Yep.
So you're spanning the cut below with the cut above, which is a full piece.
Yep.
So just like a brick wall, which is behind you now, you can that wall has integrity because you're laying over the joint each time. And I guess we've evolved a lot since LVLs, haven't we? Like, it's pretty amazing what CLT's done, because we're now seeing 14-story high buildings made out of cross-laminated timber out of Europe. And we're doing this at Barangaroo here in Sydney.
Yep.
You know, I think Lendlease were one of the first ones to sort of start pioneering it. Why is it so expensive? And how do we make it more accessible to everyone, do you think?
It's scale.
Yeah.
It's scale. And that's
And you have that problem with some of your other products? Like you've just come up with a great idea. How do you make everyone aware that this is a better use of both recycled and renewable resources and better value?
I think maybe there's a different way of thinking about this, and that is that all of the different elements of different timber products are all very complementary.
Yeah.
So there's plywood, there's solid timber, there's CLT, there's LVL. Now you can create a building solution that uses all of them. There's a little bit of competition between us, but there's building solution using this carbon negative approach, right?
Yeah.
Typically, we're competing against concrete and steel and bricks, which are not carbon negative. And where I'm going with this is that solid timber and ply and LVL and whatnot, it tends to be a lot more based around up to 7 stories. You know, that's your residential construction type activity. That's your commercial construction type activities.
Yep.
When you think about CLT, it does tend to be a lot more about your apartment, and it's displacing concrete per se.
Yes.
So CLT is not necessarily like a strength member. It's more of a panelisation type product.
Oh, right, okay.
So you think about it differently. So LVL tends to sit in the space between where solid timber as a construction methodology and between that and steel. And so what you can do is you can actually reduce the amount of steel that's in your house by using LVL, and it has better structural strength properties and safer strength properties in a fire. And so
wow.
Yeah, it's
safer than steel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's from a we're obviously invested in this industry, and so your skepticism
or invested.
Yeah. So the thing to think about here is that, and we saw it with the World Trade Center, I think globally, is that steel folds, buckles, and melts. Timber chars,
as we saw at the World Trade Centers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So people are able to, and so it's one of the, and CLT in particular has these properties where, so you think about timber burning. It doesn't work that way if you think about how timber burns in a fire. Yeah. Chars on the outside. And so
wow.
The structural integrity.
I actually thought about that.
Yeah, it's not paper, and. Yeah, and so it's one of the strengths of the products that we have.
And the beautiful thing about it is, rather than chopping down an old growth hardwood log, with LVLs, you can take much smaller caliber logs and then stitch them all together and create this thing which has more strength, more integrity, and far less waste.
Yes.
And comes from a more renewable resource, right?
That's the piece I'm really keen to explore. So the carbon negative piece, obviously from a steel and concrete perspective, cement manufacturing and steel being some of the biggest carbon emitters in the world. So from a carbon negative perspective, something that always intrigued me about your model is obviously sustainable plantation, which you touched on. Yeah, you've got a very complex supply chain, right? Growing from plantation to forestation is not an overnight thing. 20 plus years. How long is it typically? 30 years. 30. So it always intrigued me is that how do you've been planning for that for hundreds of years, your industry, right? Because from the very first time you've taken forestation, the plantations have obviously started to evolve. So how do you sort of go about planning that, and how has that changed over time? And can you talk us through a little bit around this carbon negative? What are the things that make that up? Is it the fact that it's obviously a renewable resource, and during that time it's obviously capturing carbon in the time that before it's obviously gone through forestation? And what are some of the other things that you do from an energy perspective that really help reduce your emissions profile?
It's a broad range. I need more than 30 stories to from an elevator pitch point of view. I'll jump in, Craig. I think from a plantation basis, so it takes 30 years.
Yep.
So in the way to think about it is that we think about it as a crop. So we're farmers. And so we think about the fact that we have 30 summers. So 30 summers to grow this crop. And sustainability for us is the fact that every year we're effectively cutting down 1/30th of that plantation asset. But the following year we're replanting that 1/30th. So that's where the sustainability kicks in. And so we start talking about ultimate renewable. Those plantations are actually being replanted all the time. So,
do you ever get above that ratio?
Yeah, so where I'd go back a step is that Australia's and New Zealand's plantation assets were originally established by governments, state and federal governments typically.
That's
There's a little bit of New Zealand had some private enterprise that invested originally in plantations, forest products, but fundamentally it was a nation building activity. So they could see 120 years ago that you needed more than what was the native plantation, native forest assets to populate, to build the buildings that we need. Food and fibre is what a population
definitely
needs from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so,
also what I would say, Shane, is you look at the areas they've invested in. They've also created regional centres in those areas.
Absolutely.
So there's an economy aspect to this too. This is if you think about Australia and utilising the space that we do have and the beautiful country New Zealand as well. You see these plantations, they're adding value to those areas too because people are employed. Recreational, like I grew up in Mount Gambier. I think as a kid you probably don't realise the nature around you when you've got the ocean and you've got farmland and you've got plantations, and then as you get older and you appreciate, we got to have a picnic in that area. We got to, these are sustainable plantation forests that are well managed. Yes, every year there's a, harvesting activity going on, but there's actually a lot of enjoyment of that nature going on as well. And there's a lot of practices they do around, fire management, the local area around that. There's additional work going on. It's not just plant a tree, take a tree down.
Hey, Mount Gambier is a town that's punching above its weight, isn't it?
Very much so.
There's
very
so
much
much
so.
going on there at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard recently Polytech building their facility out there is just huge capacity.
Yeah.
And you've got plenty of plantation out there. Yeah.
And
how many acres are there?
What was previously over 100 years of rotations were going through. They're previously owned by government that has been sold off. But what you've seen is the industries remained. Yeah. And it's one of those vibrant communities that you see, farming's having an impact on people's lives. Yeah. Fisheries having an impact on, so those areas of the economy that we want to be flourishing in this country. Yeah. Mount Gambier is very invested in. And continues to invest in, no different to where the plants that, Shane's business located regional. Yeah. Holt, Harvey in Australia were located in Myrtleford. These are regional communities that get to flourish because of the industries that are involved in those communities. Yeah.
Hey, Shane, back to you. You grow a few trees. How many are under your management at the moment?
So for us,
ballpark.
So for us, we've got about 15,000 hectares, which is about, broadly speaking, is about 40-odd thousand acres.
Now there's about 1,600 Pinus radiata per hectare. Would that be right?
No, so we plant about 1,200 seedlings, 1,500 seedlings
per hectare.
Year one. By the time we get to final harvest, we're down to about 300. We go through and we do our silvicultural practice is to do several what we call thinnings. So in really simple, anybody that's forestry that's listening will absolutely cringe at my really rude way of explaining it, but you basically put in a whole lot of seedlings, and what you're trying to do is that you want those seedlings to compete for the resource. The resource
for the
is light and nutrients, water. Yeah. So you want them to be putting their energy and going straight up and straight down to get the water source, straight down to get the nutrients, straight up to go for the sun. And then effectively what happens at about age 10, the way that the tree develops fundamentally shifts. So the morphology of the cellular structure changes, and what happens is that and it's very similar to going from a teenager to an adult. All of a sudden, the tree focuses more on its energy on getting stronger. At that point there, it's crowded out the lateral space, and the tree hasn't put any energy into growing branches, and this is why it's a strong product. And because now you've crowded out the canopy, what's happened is that underneath it is dark, so there's no branch growth. So at about age 10 to 12, we go through and we cut out like what we call every third row. Effectively,
Wow.
what we're doing is we're allowing that sunlight back in. We're allowing airflow, and we're also encouraging the tree to put more energy into its root development, and ensuring it's stable and so forth. And then we go through and do it again when it's about 22, and then we get to final harvest at 30.
So for the layman that thought you just plant it and come back 30 years later and take forestation down, that's not the case.
No,
right?
it's very very much like what Craig just said before. So there's typically in our industry there's plantation owners.
Yeah.
Then there's further processors like sawmillers and plywood manufacturers and LVL manufacturers.
Yeah.
AKD's a little bit different. We're integrated, so we've got plantations and trees. But to put it into a sense of scale, a business like ours, we have about 150,000 hectares of plantations that feed us on a 30-year basis.
And it's an incredible technique because there's two types of trees on the planet. There's a dicot and there's a monocot, right? And so the monocots have vertical veins, and the dicots have sort of diagonal veins. You're growing a dicot as if it was a monocot by doing this selective pruning or clearing process, because you're teaching it to grow straight, right? And long and strong, which is kind of elongating the fibre and giving you beautiful, big, straight, usable logs, yeah?
Yeah.
It's an amazing technique.
You used the word tensile strength before, which is, and so tensiles, that's basically what we chase. I'm guessing,
structural properties.
for plywood, for sawmilling, for making paper, making toilet paper.
Yeah.
It's all the same thing. It's all about tensile strength or tear strength, and from an LVL, from a solid timber point of view, the how we measure that, we call it deflection.
Yes.
So basically, how far will it bend before it ruptures?
Yes.
The beautiful thing about timber and different timber products is it actually does bend. It does actually have elasticity, and the reason why that's cool is it has memory, and after it's got a little bit of it's under pressure, it bends a little bit, it comes back like a tree does in the wind.
It flexes.
It flexes.
How incredible is
So
nature, hey?
Craig, given that it takes 30 years and all that TLC during the 30 years and that process, which all takes a lot of resource and effort from the sounds of things. When it comes to your yield, so at the end of that process, it becomes a log, right? And so then when you look at that and say, well, this is taking me 30 years and a lot of effort to get to this point.
Sounds a lot like parenting, doesn't it?
It does.
And just, Lewis, I was listening to Shane take you guys through the process. I did think we're not advocating for families to approach life like this, though, are we? Like if they've got 4 kids, just to invest in 2 of them and shift 2 to one side to make them bigger, taller, stronger. So
you are future-proofing your business, though, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're future-proofing sustainable resources, right?
Look, there's a beautiful link here back to the story about what sustainability is, right? And so it's always about looking to the future and looking at the impact that you have. So I said at the start about having sawdust in my veins. Like as a CEO, you're typically measured on, what's your EBITDA, what's your financial performance, and so forth. I can tell you now that as a CEO in this industry, my head is very much in the 2030s at the moment. I'm constantly thinking about where's the fibre coming from, how a building's going to be built, how a family's going to live in Australia, what is that going to look like?
What does your workforce need?
Workforce development, absolutely. And so for us, it's you literally can't operate in tomorrow's space. You have to be always thinking way out.
And such a long-term view to my point around the fact that it's taking you 30 years, right? So at that point, and you are thinking about the next 30 years constantly, because obviously you need to be. But when it comes to that point, how do you sort of think about the yield? Because it's a really precious resource, right? It's taking you a lot of effort and it takes a long time to grow. So when it comes to your thinking about, okay, what's the yield that we're going to get there? From a wastage perspective of that log, when it's in that form, you have very little.
Yeah.
And so how has that evolved over time, and how do you think about that in your design selection as you're thinking about equipment moving forward?
I think there's been both some internal pressure to think about waste in a process, because you're trying to make sure you'll get the value back that you paid for something that's grown for 30 years. Then I think there's also been some external pressure from the communities, from governments, to ensure that the processes that we run in Australia take care of the environment, minimise any impact on the environment, which is how, when you think of the growth of the initial tree that we then process and all that good work it does in capturing the carbon, what we've got to do is process that efficiently to ensure we don't generate more than what we started with. That's how we get to negative. So if you think about bringing we call them logs, when they arrive on our sites, the work we do from there is about capturing every bit of that log into something. Whether it's taking the bark off the outside of the log that then, is used in applications like people's gardens. You're taking that, so we don't waste that. And if you came to one of our sites, you'll see that as the log starts its initial process, anything that's coming off that log is captured, it's stored, it's looked after, because we treat it as a valuable resource.
Yeah.
Then it goes into the process. And when a log enters a process at one of our facilities, you'll see most likely the most expensive bit of technology sitting right there in front of it to start with, because that's our first chance to extract something out of that log. So the technology used at that front end of our processes, the entry point, that's where a lot of investment's gone on in our industry. Back to your original question, Jamie, about how we're keeping up.
Yeah.
So you won't see a lot of people involved at the front of our processes.
Yeah.
What you'll see is technology.
Yeah, and those residues that come off right at that, historically might have been a waste product, but this is a really good example. Obviously, the relationship that we have a repurpose it with both of your facilities is to take those byproducts. We don't call them waste because we have got a value and we consider them a resource, hence why we procure them from you.
Yes.
Right? We procure them from you because they are a very valuable resource, and it has taken you 30 years to produce that resource, and there's a lot of effort that's gone into it at that point. And then we take that and we know that it's got a second life, a really valuable second life to improving soil health, to improving people's gardens. And it's just a really good example how through your approach to be innovative and reduce your waste is actually an opportunity for somebody else and for another industry and sector. And it's just a really neat example of how a circular economy can work in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I was intrigued around the process of how you harvest these trees. And I had the ability a couple of days ago to be out on a plantation and see those Komatsu machines literally, grab a tree up to 600 mil diameter and delimit, cut it, delimit, and the guy hasn't stepped foot outside of the machine. And it's just, this thing is so nimble, and it just literally picks it up, slices it through, and then delimbs it at 5 meters a second.
Yep.
And you suddenly get these 5 meter logs just boom, spit out the other side. That's an incredible piece of tech, isn't it? How long have those things been around?
About 20 years.
Really?
Yeah, about 20, 25 years. So harvesting heads.
I've just never seen anything like it. It was amazing.
It's the big change that's probably taken place is the country that those things are able to cover now. So they used to be quite cumbersome, whereas now that they're we've seen effectively people with chaps and chugging chainsaws around has disappeared.
Yeah.
And which has made our industry at the front end from a forestry point of view a lot safer.
Yeah.
Have we lost the lumberjack?
Well, I mean, I can't think of. I mean, from an Australia point of view, I can't think of the last time I saw a person with a chainsaw in the bush.
Wow.
Yeah. So those people probably still exist a little bit in the silvicultural practices, but not so much in the final harvest.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about Pinus radiata, yeah.
Yep.
Specifically, has there been any talk around eucalyptus, FSC eucalyptus, or are you looking at other species as well, or will we continue to just keep looking at this one species?
I mean, can I jump in here a little bit? Look, eucalyptus and radiata, hardwood versus softwood, and there's some really different attributes and properties around.
Well spelled out, yeah.
Really different products, and the thing about radiata is that we come back to those decisions made 150 years ago, where they created 2 or 3 arboreums in Australia and New Zealand as they try to figure out what was the species that was going to be the one that they needed to build these nations off, and we ended up with this Monterey pine which is effectively from the Monterey Peninsula in California.
Yeah.
And the thing that's fantastic about Radiata is that it gives up its moisture really readily, and it's also got a degree of it's able to sustain growth through multiple seasons. And giving up its moisture is really important because that's what enables us to dry it and preserve it and still retain its tensile strength. And this is the part that's the kicker, and stay straight, which speaks to your questions before around fibre properties and how the structure of the fibre works. Yeah. So in Australia we have other pinus species. So say north of Byron Bay, north of Gold Coast, we use what we typically think of as being southern yellow pine, which is a mixture of Pinus tadia and Pinus caribea. In WA they use Pinus pinasta. Right. So it's a little bit based around. So Radiata is the dominant species in Australia and New Zealand, but we use other species where the environment requires it.
In little pockets, isn't it?
Yeah.
Little pockets.
Just on the drying, there's something that was keen to explore a little bit with you, because that to remove the moisture presumably takes some form of energy in the form of heat.
Yep.
So obviously heat, energy means typically cost and obviously a resource there. So how do you go about sort of what are the energy sources and what does that drying process look like in terms of how are you fueling that drying process?
Two different drying processes. I'll let Craig go first.
Yeah, so we use fuel that's generated from the log.
Yeah.
So we actually use fibre that's burnt in boilers to generate that heat, and we put that steam through our dryers. So once again, trying to use what comes onto our site, contain that on the site. Yeah. And this speaks to some of the, how far do we want to evolve species? How far do we want to, when you've got a process that works, it's easy to fall in love with that process too. So, using our own fibre as a heat source, it is really beneficial for us. Yeah. It means we don't have to seek out, too much external to the site to actually process what we process.
And have you seen, obviously with the emergence of new technology in that space, those types of processes where you're using effectively biomass, if you will, as a fuel source, have become so much more efficient over time? And through some of my own research going to parts of the UK, I found some technology in Denmark and Sweden where the efficiency around using biomass as a resource, some of those had pre-drying to deal with some of that moisture loss prior to going into the boilers, obviously. Yep. But the efficiency of those systems is just grown exponentially, is what it feels like.
We're learning all the time, aren't we?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So you guys stay very connected to that and the emergence of that, because it obviously become quite capital intensive on your scale compared to a small biomass boiler, but they seem to be moving really quick in terms of their efficiency and technology.
It's probably for our industry, it's probably the single biggest check that you'll write out as far as capital investment on a sawmilling side or a pulp and paper side or a plywood side is your energy source. And we sort of think about, so a business like ours and like some of the sawmills, you typically need a megawatt of energy to dry about 15,000 cubic metres of downstream product. And for us, we always sort of think about a megawatt costing about $1.5 million to build. So you can kind of scale it appropriately. And so it's the technologies that you invest in to make your drying efficient has two things. One is it is about sustainability, but the second thing, because we live in regional communities and nobody wants to see stacks of coal dust and coal powder and more importantly, all of those sorts of emissions.
Well, emissions are real, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why we try and manage them so tightly.
And we've all seen those archaic industries with those plumes of smoke. When you go past a sawmilling business, don't confuse the plumes of steam with plumes of smoke. But that's that big capital investment, and that's where so biomass as part of our industry has been part of our way for over 50 years.
Yep.
So
Yep.
we never think about waste streams. We only ever think about, and residue is probably a not a great term either. We tend to call them primary products and secondary products.
Yeah, absolutely.
Byproduct, something that's
Yeah.
used a lot too,
Yep.
isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also the opportunities now around alternative fuel sources. So some of the work that we've done and some of the relationships even with yourselves has been about sourcing things like waste timber. So at the end of its product life cycle, timbers that are still virgin timbers, but at the end of their timbers, hardwood timbers, utilising them as a fuel source back to your facilities.
So now we're genuinely talking about circular economy,
Correct.
right? And how cool is that? And I think this is the bit where we talk about a plantation business that we effectively cutting down the trees, replanting them, but also the biomass that gets left behind on the cutover, which is the land that's been harvested. That's all nutrients for the next generation of trees that will be grown there. So that's the branches, that's the tops of the logs, that's actually the bark that doesn't come on the truck. That comes to the sawmill site. Then you talk about making the timber products, the plywood products, and LVL and CLT. So that's where we've truly captured the carbon. That's what makes the industry, carbon negative. And then when you're talking about the fact that we then get to reuse at end of life, pallet, packaging, timber products for an energy source, for a biomass energy source, that's a genuine circular
Is
economy.
there a more sustainable industry right now than what we're talking about here? Because you look at all the examples, this is a really efficient use of resource here. There is very little wastage here at all. And some of these things, they're happening now. For example, that alternative fuel around waste timber, we're doing that today. We'll keep squeezing.
You probably got the right audience for the answer that says no, but others might argue differently. I think just to touch on some of the things Shane's talking about this, making sure that we don't have just waste sitting around in our business. As product flows through our plants, it's also something that's occurred in Australia because we do have health and safety practices that are monitored and making sure that we've got people coming onto our sites and safely returning home. Is you'll see what you would have seen 25 to 30 years ago as acceptable, where there might be some waste sitting on the floor of your plant. All that waste now is captured somewhere. Yeah. And it's put back into the process, or it's moved to the next person that can add some value with it. Yeah. Like what we get to do with you guys. Yeah. So previously, you might have seen someone walk across a plant and there'll be some loose bits of timber or maybe some veneers or just even sawdust sitting on the ground. All of that's managed now. And it's managed not just because we're trying to get the value, but it's also managed because it was unsafe to have materials sitting around and people moving like we had in history. Yeah. A lot less of that occurs now. So you can see some of the disciplines we have in Australia on being in manufacturing is actually benefiting in other ways too. Because it's forced us to start to think about, well, it's one thing to sweep it off a path or pick it up, but what are we going to do with it? Yeah. And then we said, well, why don't we put it over here? And then is there somebody that's innovating further in this chain that can then take that and say, well, I'm prepared to give you some revenue for that, or give you some value. And then you say, well, now it's even more worthwhile for me to do it. Not that we're underselling the original premise that some of those conversations started with, because, you think about the communities that we operate in, there's a reason that people enjoy being in this industry when they work, live, spend their social time in that one environment. Yeah. It's because they know that what goes on at that facility, is preserving value for something that they can see out their window, or maybe they go for a hike through the forest on a weekend, and they can see this connection all the time. And I think that's what some of these secondary processes are now bringing to it too, because what they're getting to do is they're getting to use those products now too. Yeah. And they're getting excited about that because they know where it started from. It started 30 years ago, somewhere.
Shane, I heard some stats initially about, a full growth tree sequestering up to a ton of carbon in its lifetime. You guys must be absorbing millions of tons of carbon. And I guess what a lot of people don't think about is the fact that these trees aren't sort of coming down and then simply decaying and then that carbon's released again. What we're talking about is sequestering the carbon, holding it in the log, and then it ending up in somebody's home as a carbon bank.
100%. Yep.
Tell me about that.
Oh, I don't think I need to, Jamie. I think you just done a really good job.
No, but are there some stats around how, like, Australian homes holding all that carbon?
Yeah, there are, and I'm now feeling pretty guilty because I can't think of what those stats
We
are.
can get them up, Maria. We've got some stats.
But it's pretty amazing,
Oh, there's
right?
a-
When you
yeah.
think about it,
There's
because
about 12 to 14 cubic meters of timber that goes into the
a house.
construction of a house.
yeah.
And so if you say that there's basically, I've got to try and think about this for a minute. I haven't done my maths beforehand, but I'm guessing that would probably equate out to somewhere around about.
You got 1,200 trees per hectare.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to.
And
So 1,400 cube of timber. So 14 cube of timber would require about 30 tons of, or 25 tons of logs to come in.
Yes.
And so, in theory, if we said at least half of that was carbon, because the other half is water,
Yeah.
you're sort of talking, somewhere around about 10 to 14 tons of carbon.
Wow.
Have I got that right?
Yeah.
It feels.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know,
Hey, one of the other little tips I saw out in those forests recently was when those trees are delimbed, and you guys have to think about this, right? Because you're replanting back into the same soils that you're harvesting from. So you've got to think about erosion. Then you've got to think about how it's planted. So as a landscape designer, I'm always thinking about how we plant on a sloping block, right? And I'll always plant across the block rather than down the block. Otherwise, we're creating rows or rills of topsoil erosion issues.
Yep.
So you're planting across the crop, but when those trees come down and they're being delimbed, all of that lovely foliage is ending up, boom, like carpet on the floor of the forest. And so the machines that are moving around on top of that dense sort of foliage is not tearing up the topsoil, so it's ready for the next planting. It's so amazing.
Yeah, the way that you touch the ground when you're doing the harvesting process is a big part of having sustainable practices.
Because you don't want compaction.
Well, there's a couple of things. You don't want compaction, but you don't want to create a whole lot of holes or break through that top 6 to 10 inches, and then end up with effectively watercourses that then rip and strip all of that topsoil and then shift it all the way down to the local streams or onto the neighbours' properties and everything else.
Because that takes 100 years for 1 inch of topsoil to develop.
Yeah, right. And so I think when you think about forestry businesses, they are landscape managers as well.
Yeah.
So when we buy land to plant trees, and you asked a question earlier about expanding the plantation base. So last year AKD we purchased around about we've purchased about 3,000 hectares in the last 3 years, and we've got about another 2,500 hectares to plant in the next 12 months. So it's about a 5,500 hectare, which is about 13,000 acres. When we buying that land, we'll end up with about 10,000 of the 13,000 in pine. The rest of it will be ruminant native veg. It'll be a combination of streams, setbacks from neighbours, wetlands. So you are managing more than just the tree crop. You've got to think about sustainable practices that take you forward. So it's so we talk about it from a net plantable area, as distinct from purely just saying, right, we're just going to cut everything down and plant every possible square inch.
Yeah.
You've actually got to do it in a responsible way, which is how you maintain your certification processes.
Yeah.
But it's also, and this is I was hoping for an opportunity to say this, and I'll grab it. I think about the people that I work with and for that own AKD. And they're the directors, and they're a bunch of old dudes in their 70s. and what I absolutely love about working for these guys is they're never going to enjoy the shade of the trees that they're planting.
Yeah,
and that's sustainability.
It's a selfless
stewardship. It's custodianship. That's where they're planting the trees for the sustainability of the business, sustainability of our communities.
Yeah.
And they're looking at it from an intergenerational point of view, not about how they maximise the cash returns today.
And I think that's something any business could learn from in that long-term approach.
Yeah,
because you build a business and obviously in particular around from a sustainability perspective around making sure that we tread lightly on the planet,
Yep.
which is obviously a lot of work that Jamie and I have been doing in this series, but also in terms of sustainability of that business for all the reasons that you've touched on. And you hear the passion around the workforce, the local footprint,
Yep.
the reliance that other industries have on it, making sure that the business is sustainable, that it's going to be around to have similar stories where it's 50, 70, 100 years of history.
Yeah.
Where it's been part of a nation building exercise, where it's had a legacy that it can look back on and say, we've created this workforce that have embedded themselves in these communities, that have treaded lightly on the planet, that are constantly evolving their processes. And that's the type of legacy that I think a lot of businesses can learn from your sector, because you hear these stories more in a business like yours and an industry like yours that's had to think long term. Because it takes 30 years, and they've had to think in the context of the next 30 years. Your business plan has never been a 12-month business plan. We had that brief chat just earlier. You're always thinking, well, where's my resource going to come from in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years? I think it's a really nice way to think about, business and investing long term, because then you do make more sustainable choices.
That's right.
Think too, we're talking a lot about the processes of generating products into the building and construction industry. But even think further to some of those sustainable relationships you have in your households. A trailer arrives and it puts some mulch on the ground. Your kid comes out with you. Maybe not always happily, but they come out with you and you spend time. Yeah? Or, in my garage.
Gardens have a lovely way of gluing people together.
Yeah, and just keeps them connected to... Like you talked about, Jamie, the ground. It keeps them connected to that there's more things going on. Yeah. And we can do it together. I think about plywood specifically, but I know, timber's no different. It's a product that anybody can work with. Yeah. So what happens is, let's build a doghouse. Do we go buy one? Do we have a crack at doing one? Now, if my wife was here, she'd explain pretty clearly me having a go at building a... doghouse is going to take a while, but you engage in the first part and then we probably buy one anyway. But you can, it's things you can do too. Yeah. Which I think is important about this sustainability piece we're talking to. It gets people reinvested in the products. Yeah. Those products have already been planted. We have people in this country, New Zealand and Australia, that are experts in how to process these products. What a great way to reinvest in the whole cycle of it.
Hey, listen, before we had you blokes coming on, I did a little bit of research on the business development front, and I wanted to share some of these tips with you just for your interest if you need. Okay. Because I'm sure you've thought of a few ideas on how to expand the business, but one is, did you know that in Japan now you can go on a forest bathing tour? So you guys would be pretty healthy, wouldn't you? And why don't you start selling these tours walking through your forests? It's genius.
So what we need to say, Jamie, is we know this already. We just don't want a whole heap of people walking through the forest when we're walking. So we've been keeping a lid on it, actually, haven't we, Shane?
Absolutely. So when you say Japanese bathing, it's clothes on?
No, it's forest bathing, mate. It's happening in all sorts of countries, not just Kyoto, but everywhere.
See, what's interesting, what you've just said, is that you're probably describing something that's unique for someone that lives in the city and completely normal for who lives in the country. Yeah. And so what you just described, I'm kind of going, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. We do that in the weekends.
Yeah, we are all suffering nature deficit disorder, right? Yeah. It is a problem. There was a book written about this called The Last Child in the Woods. And it's about our generation suffering nature deficit disorder. So you guys have the end solution here. Yeah. And you look pretty healthy to me, Shane. You spend a fair bit of time in the forest, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Right, so why isn't this a tour? This is a side hustle for you.
Actually, Jamie, why don't we go a different direction on this? And maybe why don't we have a verbal attack on town planners?
Yeah, planting. Yeah, okay.
Or planting tar seal, and where has the trees gone from our
creating monocultures?
Oh man, it drives
no biodiversity whatsoever.
Yeah. Absolutely,
don't get me started on this one.
It drives me mental.
For the shops.
If I see another row of tuckaroos or London plane trees, and you can hear my allergies right now, right? Every time I come to Melbourne, I'm like, boom, the London plane trees. Yep. They're related to the horse chestnut tree, which is the most allergenic tree on the planet. And every time I come here, boom, I feel it straight away. But we are planting monocultures through all of our streets, and we're asking people to plant their backyards with biodiversity. But what are the town planners doing about biodiversity in our streetscapes?
And look, if you go to any of the inner suburban locations, what do we love? Everybody wants the house with the huge trees out the front and that environment. And then you go to like some of our more recent suburbs have been built, and you're lucky if you have a monoculture of trees. Quite often, it's actually there is no curbside, there is no backyard. Flying into some of our major centres, I think it's actually really, really criminal.
No, it is. And do you know? Here's the bad stat.
Here now, Shane.
Jamie
fired up.
Mate, this is a real beef of mine, right? Because I was trained as a horticulturalist, and I spent 4 years learning 3,764 species, their cultivars, their genus, their places of origin, their pH levels. All of those things were a part of my everyday education. But the landscape architects of our nation, who go through a 4-year course, only come out of college learning 120 trees. And that is why, and the landscape architects are the ones doing the urban planning. So how big's their library? And how big is a horticulturalist library? That's why I studied what I studied, because I can talk to blokes like you with a bit of knowledge, right? So, but these other young landscape architects that are coming out, they simply don't have the libraries in them to plant biodiversity. And we're all slinging this word around, greenwashing, like crazy, but it drives me mental because there is no biodiversity in our industry. We're not teaching our young students what is a biodiversity landscape.
The thing that I always think about is that a mammal requires lungs, right? And a city requires lungs. You need something that's going to be consuming carbon. Now, what do we know that a city emits a lot of is carbon. So why is it that we've got all of these councils that are talking about needing carbon credits, which feels like they're fiddling around the edges as compared to actually looking at the way that the suburbs are being developed. And, there's certainly not a lot of carbon capture when you've got no trees planted in the backyards. There's no trees planted in the front yards.
So you think about that, Shane, what they're doing, they're putting the requirements on the builders and architects to improve the home whilst they're not improving the environment around it. Is that when you think about the requirements now on how many stars and what's your energy rating,
which is all about
what materials,
which is all about more energy consumption, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So there's thermal efficiency, but you've got to have an aircon unit on the roof. You've got to have solar on the roof. You've got to do all these other things. And I look at it and go, there's some rudimentaries that make we come back to what life's like when you've got virgin materials like timber. And we've creating these living environments where people in multi-level residential and single dwelling, detached dwellings where there's no trees in their environment. No parks. And now we wonder why we've got social unrest problems in some of these areas.
That's right. Yeah,
because they're not coming outside.
There were some stats in New York and even China where crime had been reduced by 38% just through putting in urban parklands because those communities had a greater connection to nature. So it does give us so many assets, doesn't it? Why are we so hell-bent on putting in development applications and then building inspectors are coming around making sure you've built the door in the right place and use the right materials, but no one's coming in to inspect the biodiversity in your own backyard. We're chopping down all the trees, putting out turf, pumping it full of fertilizers and pesticides, watching it wash off into the streets in our drains and our oceans and our riverways, and no one's actually policing what is happening in our own backyards. No one comes back after a house is built and gone, so you didn't plant 16 tuckaroos and acacia floribunda and where are the natives? Who's going to babysit the bees? Just another little side hustle, lads. I saw recently on the gram, there was a bloke in, and it was in a third world country, but necessity is the mother of all invention. He was an electrician, and he'd found a way of tucking 2 little probes into the trunk of the tree, and then he ran a USB cable off it and everyone was coming and charging their phones off the tree. Do you know about this?
No.
No, I haven't heard this.
Okay, I'm working for you, right? I'm trying to like give you other little lateral,
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, I can just imagine taking that back to the workforce. They already think I'm nuts as it is. Yeah. Jamie tells me that we can charge all our phones.
I thought he was going to tell you plug in your earphones and you listen to the heartbeat of the tree.
What could be worse?
I love that. I love that. Plant a tree, charge your iPhone.
That's it. That's it.
What could be worse? They could tell us they already knew about it and just
So good. Hey guys, it's been so interesting. Thank you for the chat today. And I've learned a ton. You, George?
Absolutely. Really
Yeah.
appreciate your time, Shane,
Really
Craig.
awesome.
Really valuable discussion. Learned so much.
Yeah.
And
Keep soaking up all that carbon, lads, and bring us some more beautiful building products from a sustainable resource.
Thanks very much.
Thanks
Thanks very much.